You know, it's absolutely wild how the exact same film can be a radically different experience depending entirely on the lens you view it through. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the film Hamnet, which is based on Maggie O'Farrell's novel and directed by Chloe Zhao. But we aren't just doing a standard movie recap. No, we are looking at two specific real-world reviews that find themselves completely, literally at odds with one another. I mean, they don't just disagree on whether the movie is good or bad, they disagree on the fundamental meaning of the film's central relationships. How on earth can two people watch the exact same scream and walk away with two entirely opposed narratives? Well, it's all about the cultural and personal expectations they bring into the theater.
So let's jump right into our agenda for this explainer. First, a tale of two critics. Second, who is Agnes? Third, gender, power, and society. Fourth, the central tragedy. Fifth, tone, taste, and execution. And finally, we'll wrap up with the power of perspective.
All right, Section 1, A Tale of Two Critics.
So we're looking at a specific cinematic adaptation today, and two completely different viewing experiences. On the left, we have a critique from Nora Kenney writing for the American Conservative. This review, it basically finds the film tedious, heavily politically loaded, and ultimately a failure in its storytelling. But then, on the flip side, we have a review from an independent Substack by Jordan R., who sees the exact same film as this profound, incredibly restrained exploration of marital salvation and existential grief. It's like they watched two completely different movies.
Moving on to Section 2. Who is Agnes?
The core conflict between these two reviews isn't actually about the plot mechanics at all. It's fundamentally about how each critic reads the film's central character, William Shakespeare's wife, Agnes. The American Conservative Review frames Agnes entirely through this Gen Z concept of the pick-me girl. The critic argues that Agnes's behavior, wandering through the forest, commuting with animals while all the other women are busy sewing and praying, is presented with this solemn devotion that just feels morally sanctimonious. To this reviewer, Agnes isn't deep at all. She's a total cliché. Her forest dwelling is seen as just an overused cinematic trope meant to signal this unearned, shallow authenticity.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the Substack review counters this. They use this fantastic concept of illegibility to describe Agnes. They argue that she's set apart, retreating to the wilderness to gain insight that's simply unattainable in the village. Because she is a totally unprecedented entity in her small hamlet, she defies their language. She is genuinely novel, like a literal force of nature that the society around her simply lacks the vocabulary to even understand.
So here we have our core philosophical divergence right on full display. The reviewer on the left sees a flat, predictable trope designed to basically force the audience to admire her supposed moral superiority. But the reviewer on the right sees a deeply complex woman who is tragically misunderstood by a world that literally cannot articulate her existence.
The American Conservative argues that the film is essentially lecturing us. They state that, quote, quirkiness is used as synonymous with spiritual depth rather than as one complicated human response among many. By equating Agnes's quirkiness with spiritual depth, they're arguing the film flattens what could have been a super complex psychological drama into this predictable main character syndrome fantasy. For them, every single scene just smugly confirms what we're being conditioned to admire.
But check this out. The Substack reviewer takes this exact same quirkiness and elevates it to absolute existential stakes. They argue that Agnes's knowledge, her ability to understand the natural world in a way others just can't, creates a very real, justified threat to men who lack her faculties. Hence, the village brands her with the pejorative witch. It's not just a cute quirk, it's a dangerous alien intelligence trying to survive in a small, closed-minded town. Which brings us to Section 3, Gender, Power, and Society.
This foundational disagreement naturally bleeds right into the broader societal commentary of the film. I want you to really think about this as we move forward. How does your reading of Agnes dictate your reading of the entire film's politics? Because for our two critics, the stakes are about to escalate significantly. The American Conservative sees the film's treatment of gender as serving a very modern political agenda, essentially attempting a gotcha against dead white males by hijacking a famous historical narrative. The Substack review, however, argues that the film isn't taking down men at all. Instead, it's critiquing the restrictive performance of masculinity, showing us exactly how a rigid society shapes young boys into bullies. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer frustration from the American Conservative. They argue the film engages in, frankly, cultural smugness. By sidelining the male perspective, specifically that deep, historical father-son dynamic that fans of Shakespeare expect, just to celebrate female quirkiness, they feel the film is just politically posturing rather than telling a genuine, well-rounded tragedy.
Conversely, the Substack reviewer sees Agnes as the absolute key to William's liberation. Because she sits completely outside the village's rigid social structure, she is the only one who actually recognizes the true man beneath that restrictive, violent, masculine performance expected of him. It's her recognition that allows William to finally confront his abusers and transcend his environment to become the legendary writer we know today.
All right, Section 4, the central tragedy.
Now we arrive at the emotional core of the whole story, the death of the child, Hamnet. Now, both reviewers absolutely acknowledge this is the central pivot of the plot, but while the American conservative feels totally cheated out of the historical father-son grief that the title itself promises, the Substack review sees the child's death very differently. They see it as merely the bridge to a much deeper, far more devastating marital despair between William and Agnes.
Let's break down the frustration on the left. The American conservative rightly notes that the film is literally titled Hamnet, which obviously evokes the play Hamlet, a literal masterwork on fathers and sons, inheritance and authority. Yet, the film treats young Hamnet as just a symbol. It ignores the psychological weight of Shakespeare's own abusive father and completely misses the opportunity to explore how this deeply private catastrophe was forged into public art. They wanted a profound exploration of loss, and they feel they didn't get it.
But the Substack review reads this exact same event with a radically different focus. They argue the tragedy isn't just the death of the boy. The true, gut-wrenching tragedy is that Agnes's illegible power, all that forest magic that previously saved her family, utterly fails her when she needs it most. It's actually little Hamnet who bargains for his sister's life. And this opens a massive psychological chasm because the focus is now squarely on a powerful savior who ultimately failed to save her own son.
Moving to Section 5, Tone, Taste, and Execution. So these massive thematic disagreements, they don't just stay in the realm of academic theory. They bleed directly into the critic's raw viewing experiences, literally determining whether they actually enjoyed sitting in the theater. This is the ultimate clash of taste. The American conservative finds the movie boring, tedious, and overly sentimental, basically accusing it of lacking any real subtlety. The Substack reviewer, on the other hand, calls the film incredible, praising its slow build and finding its restraint to be exactly what makes the emotional payoff so unbelievably profound.
This quote from the American conservative is pretty striking. They argue the emotional cues are so corny and pre-programmed that the film feels almost coercive. Because it lacks that essential Shakespearean subtlety, the pacing is just completely deflating. The critic says they feel domesticated, dare I say longhoused, which is basically internet slang for feeling trapped in this overly domesticated, hyper-feminized environment by a movie that refuses to let its audience discover anything for themselves.
But the Substack reviewer embraces this exact execution. They argue the film isn't trying to be a traditional father-son drama at all. It's a spousal psychodrama. The climax isn't about the boy, it's about William writing the play Hamlet as a specific, incredibly intimate gift to Agnes. He creates a language of grief on stage to finally make his illegible wife legible to herself, effectively pulling her back from the brink of despair. The film is about the making of Hamlet as an act of marital love.
And finally, Section 6, The Power of Perspective.
When we look at these two reviews side by side on this matrix, we aren't just learning about a single movie. We're learning about how art functions as a mirror. From Agnes to gender to grief, the divergence between these two critics is total. But here's the thing, while the critique of modern tropes is definitely an interesting angle, dismissing Agnes as just a pick-me-girl cliché kind of leaves the most compelling parts of the movie on the table. When we embrace the more complex lens, viewing this as a quiet, profound exploration of two people navigating the absolute limits of language and saving each other through art, it just reveals so much more about the messy reality of human connection. It leaves us with a vital question to ask ourselves the next time we watch a film. Which lens actually reveals more about the depth of the art on the screen, and which reveals more about the biases of the audience sitting in the dark?